Here is an excerpt from a conversation between Plejaren Ptaah and me, Billy,
from the official 712th contact report on the 30th of October 2018.
Translated with deepl.com. Disclaimer: this is an unofficial translation. Source:
FIGU-zeitzeichen.
107 on page 3 to 5.
Very interesting, but I have known the draft of this UN Migration Pact for quite some time, as well as the unlawful machinations of the Swiss UN ambassador, who is mentioned in this article, which are damaging to the Swiss state and the Swiss population. If in Marrakesh this UN Migration Pact actually comes into being and is recognized, accepted and signed by the Swiss delegation, then the Swiss state will become involved in a matter that will ultimately, because in the future various other compelling machinations will follow this UN Migration Pact, restrict more and more the freedom of the Swiss state and its entire population. And as for the negative possibilities listed in this article, they are by no means illusory, for if Switzerland were to be included in this pact by treaty, it would mean the beginning and entry into a UN bailiwick, as is already the case with regard to the contractual dealings with the EU dictatorship, in which country representatives were forced to enter irresponsibly as a result of their lack of necessity, incompetence and decision-making power, as well as their lack of vision, to the detriment of Switzerland and its people.
We don't want to politicize. We don't want to interfere directly in politics, nor do we want to be politically inflammatory, but I think that according to the freedom of expression we can and may simply express our opinion, whereby I think that we may say what the given facts are and what can result from everything after reasonable consideration and probable foresight. So, according to this article, I thought about it and made probability calculations, which resulted in quite big evils. The admonitions listed in the article are indeed hand and foot and yielded results which indicated that in the course of time everything is very likely to develop and result in the way their
Swiss time
admonitions show on the one hand, but on the other hand my calculations also showed that in the long run Switzerland and its entire population would ultimately fall under the total command of the UN and also of the EU dictatorship. As a result, the state of Switzerland and the entire Swiss people would ultimately lose all freedom of action and self-determination, as well as all freedom to have its own federal constitution, legislation, penal code, etc., 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 etc. Even the army would ultimately no longer be subject to Swiss law, but would be under the direct command of the UN on the one hand and in connection with the EU dictatorship on the other. Ultimately, as my probability calculations showed, Switzerland would then, as a result of the prevailing international law, be under its death fox and toad's factail is effectively meant seriously, because my calculations have also shown that this UN Migration Pact in international law could possibly reintroduce the death penalty worldwide, as was the case with the EU dictatorship. In fact, with and through the EU constitution, for all EU dictatorship states, it has reintroduced the death penalty, which can be used again at any time, but which is concealed from the populations of the EU dictatorship states. Overall, the principle applies, as will be the case, according to my high-value probability calculations, when international law possibly comes into being, that international law breaks and overrides all national law. And the same will happen sooner or later when the UN Migration Pact comes into being, whereby in future everything will also apply to Switzerland and its people if the responsible state leaders irresponsibly sign the UN Pact contractually. If this were to happen, Switzerland and the Swiss people would immediately be subject to the UN Migration Pact law, as was already the case with the governmental irrationality and self-assertion of those responsible in Switzerland who forced Switzerland under EU dictatorship law through various treaties. The UN Migration Pact law will violate all national laws, including those of Switzerland, if the stupidity and irresponsibility of those responsible for them may win. This would ultimately undermine the federal constitution in Switzerland and thus every fundamental right, and the death penalty would be carried out again at will in accordance with the constitution on international law. And if that were to happen, precisely through the guilt and will of the politicians and their stupid supporters from the people who screamed for it, then these politicians and their stupid supporters from the people would also have to be responsible for making peace, freedom and justice in Switzerland null and void. The whole of the UN Migration Pact at any rate violates the Swiss federal constitution, even in its present form, as well as if the new international law were to reintroduce and execute the death penalty in Switzerland as well. Ergo, only idiots, pathologically stupid, masochists, schizophrenics and suicidal people, etc. blindly trust those politicians and country representatives who are incapable of judgment, who in their power behavior throw their states and peoples into misery in an idiotic, autocratic and morbidly stupid way. But even many of the populations themselves are stupider than bean straw and believe those misbehaving politicians and take their lies, deceptions and false machinations as hard cash, reality and truth, which cannot be trusted and whose intellect and reason as well as judgment and conscience is nothing more than a rotten waste product of their poor intelligence. And that of course exactly this kind of politicians and their followers from the nations do not want to recognize themselves as affected, but accuse all righteous politicians, representatives of the people, rulers, citizens from the nations. That is clear, because the guilty never want to be guilty, as it is also the case with the goddamn believers. And it is precisely in this relationship that the majority of God believers who squat in politics and verbally throw around the man-made lies, slander and deceptions regarding
God's word
are the worst. And in this regard there are countless rulers around the world who, as believers in God, often bring God, their
holy
scriptures and
word of God
into the field, in order to win political supporters and supporters of state power from the populations, whereby the stupid and simple-minded then believe the seducers in a religiously heedful way. And therefore it is not surprising that around the world of all people many rulers, politicians and country representatives etc. exercise power in governments and public offices and can fool their people into believing false and contemptuous religious roles. And they can do so even though they lack the intellect, reason and intelligence necessary for their office and are therefore incapable of running a state and its population. As a result, the fact is that they are no more and no less selfish and self-opinionated sad creatures, incapable of peaceful, liberal, just politics and governance, nor of truly working for and doing the best for their states and peoples. But the fact is that many of these elements always push their religious faith and their God into the foreground, because they have fallen prey to the delusion of the
holy word.
Whether really, allegedly or advantageously, let that be left open, and they live in delusional faith to receive divine instructions and to hear heavenly messages, and that it is these very believers in God who are in power, who have neither an interest nor a responsibility for peace, freedom, justice and humanity as well as for healthy and necessary measures for saving planning and action with regard to the healthy preservation and regeneration of nature, its fauna and flora, the seas and sweet waters, the climate, the entire environment and the earth itself as well as its mankind. that corresponds to an unparalleled testimony of depravity. However, this also refers to the urgently necessary and humane reduction of overpopulation through a worldwide birth stop and an inevitable global birth control. On the other hand, the misbehaving part of the great mouths who sit at the helm of the government and participate in politics has neither an interest nor an understanding, nor do those from the populations who cheer for them. All of them, the mistaken part of the politicians and rulers who act just as irresponsibly as the part of those who like them and cheer them up from the peoples, only live out their personal desires, ideas, pleasures, their wealth, individual well-being and their degenerated joys. But that they all, the whole part of the fallible selfish, egoistic and power-obsessed politicians and rulers etc., as well as the majority of the peoples who are in bondage to them, thus continue to preserve all degenerated and evil in every respect, constantly increase, drive on and drive the entire earth, humanity as well as nature, fauna and flora, the entire environment and the planet Earth itself into a tremendous and irreparable catastrophe, that is completely irrelevant to all of them. So they continue to work thoughtlessly and irresponsibly, idiotically and unstoppably, promoting and fomenting fear, strife, lack of freedom, terror and wars all over the world and among all states and peoples. As a result, by that part of the politicians and rulers as well as by the naive peoples cheering for them, who shit their pants in cowardice fear of the allegedly
hostile
other states, the military and
defense
expenditures are constantly increasing, the weapon potentials are infinitely increased with new modern lethal weapon systems and hatred and enmity are vehemently bred. But that is not enough, because those idiots among the politicians and rulers who, in cowardly fear of foreign states that are supposed to be enemies, wear their trousers, incite their peoples and additionally demand the further expansion of their armies, or where there are no armies yet, that such should be brought into being and built up, and the fact that everything degenerate, evil and terror continue to emerge and rampage through it, this fact is probably clear even to the most uneducated, dullest and weakest in intelligence man in the backwoods, but obviously not to the failures of politics and governments, nor to the large masses of populations who think they are better than the unneeded in the bush and who are faithful to the populist powers and their lied religious slogans, and that they all make themselves ridiculous and sneak into the butts of those politicians and state leaders who are causing political and governmental misfortune. They do not realize that either, nor that they live in madness, are themselves highly educated, shod, clever, well-informed, very rich in content, well-founded, taught, trained, informed, knowledgeable, saddle-bound, safe, unassailable, infallible, well-informed and reliable, but truthfully have nothing of all this, but are contrary to absolutely more than just stupid and being stupid.
I can only judge of remarks in this way by supporting them. But I want to say that the majority of all earthly politicians and rulers do not really know how to lead their states and peoples to their well-being, security, peace and freedom, but only for the sake of their personal power and interests and misuse their high positions for this purpose. Moreover, the same great fear of other states and peoples who are expected to engage in warlike attacks is infested with the same fear, which leads to the fearful state officials constantly pushing for arms of all kinds and for great military power, which requires billions of dollars in finances which could otherwise be used for the good of peace, useful progress and the effective well-being of the peoples. And further it is to be said, without having any arrogant or degrading illusions or thoughts, that the majority of all those who are politically and governmentally active worldwide, as well as the majority of the populations, even if they are regarded as adults in terms of age and physicality, from our point of view and attitude of consciousness, reason, intelligence, our knowledge and our perception of responsibility, all have an overall behavior which only comes to light with us if we are still uneducated adolescents. Real adulthood cannot simply be given according to age and physical adulthood, as is wrongly understood by terrestrial human beings, but only according to mind, reason, intelligence, sense of responsibility and all other necessary factors which guarantee a correct, peaceful, liberal and just life as well as the ability to think, decide and act. And these are the high values which the majority of earthly politicians, rulers and populations lack, which is why they are incapable of making the right decisions and actions with regard to peace, freedom and justice, why they devise irrationally degenerating wrong decisions and accordingly also act equally, imagining that they would do good and the best in a well-considered way, but truthfully create need and misery, discord, lack of freedom and injustice, and they do this because as a result of misunderstandings, hatred and fear etc. towards other states and people they only create enmity and violent ideas of violence in themselves. From this they then raise their voices and make nonsensical, fearful speeches, which repeatedly give rise to suggestive and evil enmity-creating talk, thereby raising the fear of enemies and ultimately provoking weapons, terror and wars.